Welcome to the deep dive. We've pulled some critical nuggets from our source material, and today we're doing a really fascinating and frankly, pretty consequential deep dive into a place that, for most of us, is just a huge shape on a map, Greenland.
Yeah, and our sources give this just an astonishing look behind the curtain. We're talking about the strategies, both diplomatic and, well, potentially military, that were reportedly considered by the Trump administration to annex the world's largest island from Denmark.
And the core of this whole story is the former president saying repeatedly that he wanted Greenland very badly. He called it essentially a large real estate deal.
Right, but what really took this from, a strange idea to a full-blown geopolitical crisis was the rhetoric that followed. The sources confirmed the administration talked about escalating, threatening, if we don't do it the easy way, we're going to do it the hard way.
And to really understand how one NATO ally could even think about threatening another over real estate, you have to look at the context.
Exactly. The sources paint a picture of an administration that was willing to operate way outside of normal diplomatic lines. This Greenland issue flared up not long after the alleged plan to abduct Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro.
Which is a completely separate event, but it sort of set a precedent.
It did. It showed a willingness to engage in these extreme, non-traditional foreign policy measures. And once that line gets blurred, threatening a small nation like Denmark over Greenland suddenly becomes chillingly an option on the table.
Okay, let's break this down. Let's start with the diplomatic path, the so-called easy way. What were the specific strategies discussed in the White House to, well, essentially buy out a nation?
So the administration really pursued two main tracks. The first was the traditional one, a direct purchase proposal to Copenhagen, to the Danish government.
And that went over well, I assume.
Oh, it was immediately and publicly rejected, repeatedly. So that led to the second track, which is what makes this story so unique. It was an attempt to bypass the sovereign government entirely and influence the nearly 56,000 Greenlandic residents directly.
So they were trying to start a kind of grassroots movement using cash transfers. What kind of dollar amounts were we talking about here?
The proposals were really specific. White House officials reportedly discussed direct payments to individual Greenlanders, and the figures ranged from, say, a baseline of $10,000 all the way up to $100,000 per person.
$100,000 per person? Wow. If you use that top figure, what's the total price tag on an influence campaign like that?
The calculation comes out to about $5.6 billion, but the money wasn't just, a bribe. It was meant as leverage.
Leverage for what, exactly?
Well, Greenland has had the right to vote for full independence from Denmark since 2009. So the goal of these huge payments was pretty clear. Convince the population to vote for secession. That would clear the legal hurdle, and then an independent Greenland could be sold or brought under U.S. influence.
It's just so hard to get your head around. I mean, was there any internal debate in the White House about the sheer impropriety of this? Trying to pay off the citizens of an allied nation?
That's a great question. The sources don't really focus on the ethical debate so much as the strategic opportunity. The justification was purely pragmatic. If the U.S. could get what it wanted for $5.6 billion, that was considered cheap.
So just a transaction?
A very large political transaction, yes. They were banking on the island's economic vulnerability. I mean, its economy is mostly fishing, so these proposed payouts were huge compared to the average income.
And this whole financial proposal, it really highlights a historical pattern, doesn't it? This wasn't just some sudden idea. The U.S. has tried to buy territory from Denmark before.
Oh, absolutely. This history is vital context. The U.S. actually succeeded once. Back in 1917, during World War I, they bought the Danish West Indies for $25 million in gold.
Which we now know as the U.S. Virgin Islands.
Exactly. And that deal worked mostly because Denmark was under immense pressure, with a global conflict going on. But when you look at earlier attempts to buy Greenland specifically,
It was always a no.
always outright rejection. Secretary of State William Seward considered it in the 1860s, and then the most famous attempt was in 1946, after World War II. President Truman formally offered Denmark $100 million in gold for the island.
And Truman's reason back then was purely about the Soviets, right?
Purely strategic, yeah. It was all about monitoring Soviet movements into the Atlantic. Denmark flatly rejected the offer. But the recent interest is more complex. It's about strategic location and this immense mineral wealth, and it's targeting not just Russia, but China, too.
So even with this massive financial carrot being dangled, $5.6 billion, the opposition from Greenland and Denmark was just Total.
It was completely decisive. Both Nuuk, the Greenlandic capital, and Copenhagen just kept saying the island is not for sale. And the people there feel the same way. A 2025 poll showed almost 85% of Greenlanders reject joining the U.S. They might want independence from Denmark, but they want sovereignty, not a new owner.
Which brings us to the critique from economist Jeffrey Sachs. What was his takeaway on this whole buyout attempt?
Sachs basically called it an affront and threat to Danish and European sovereignty. He argued that Trump thought he could buy Greenland on the cheap, and that this whole effort should be forcefully opposed, that Greenland is not a political plaything of the United States.
Okay, so if the easy way was seen as this huge affront to sovereignty and it failed completely, let's pivot to the hard way. We know military action was discussed.
And this is where the story shifts from a kind of bizarre negotiation into a potential international crisis. What's so concerning here is the direct conflict it creates within NATO.
Right. Both the U.S. and Denmark are founding members.
Exactly, from 1949. So political analysts in our sources stress that a U.S. attack on Greenland would be a catastrophic violation of the entire treaty. I mean, Article 5 is the cornerstone. An attack on one is an attack on all.
For one member to attack another just blows the whole thing up.
It collapses the entire mutual defense pact.
So how did the Danes respond to this threat? Was it just dismissed as rhetoric?
No, it was taken very, very seriously. Denmark warned that an attack like that would effectively end the alliance. It would prove the U.S. wasn't a reliable partner, but a direct aggressor against its own allies.
So what was the national security reason given to justify such a massive geopolitical gamble?
The stated justification was a rising threat from Russia and China. The former president claimed that Greenland is covered with Russian and Chinese ships all over the place, and that Denmark just couldn't handle it.
And did the sources find any evidence for that claim? Ships swarming Greenland.
They found the opposite, actually. While Russia and China are definitely active in the broader Arctic, the sources explicitly state there's no evidence of their ships operating near Greenland in the way that was claimed. It suggests the rhetoric was based more on a perceived future threat, or maybe exaggeration rather than current data.
Okay, let's talk about the U.S. military footprint that's already there, because the U.S. isn't starting from scratch if they chose the hard way.
Not at all. The U.S. has had a major military presence in Greenland since 1951. The most critical part is the Patuxent Space Base, which used to be called Thule Air Base. It's way up in the northwest corner of the island.
And its main job is missile defense. What does that actually look like on the ground?
It's mostly about detection. Early warning. Patuxent has these huge, sophisticated radar systems that look out over the Arctic. Their job is to spot incoming ballistic missiles, especially any that would fly over the polar region from Russia towards North America. It's absolutely critical for U.S. continental defense.
And that 1951 agreement gives the U.S. some pretty special status for its personnel there, right?
It does. The base has about 650 personnel from the Air Force and Space Force, and crucially, under the pact, they're all exempt from Danish laws and taxes. They're essentially outside of Danish legal control.
So if the hard way were ever carried out, what's the military thinking? Could the U.S. use its forces there to pull off some kind of soft occupation?
Analysts believe they probably could. Denmark has forces in Greenland, but they're mostly focused on things like surveillance and search and rescue. They're lightly armed. The sources suggest that if the U.S. used its existing troops, they could likely establish control without much military resistance or bloodshed.
And the mere possibility of that is what makes the threat so devastating.
Exactly. The idea that one NATO ally could successfully occupy another one just shatters the trust the alliance is built on.
So with buying being a no-go and invasion being an alliance ender, was there some kind of middle ground discussed? A hybrid option?
Yes, there was. There was a quiet diplomatic back channel that was exploring a kind of sovereignty sharing structure, specifically modeled on a Compact of Free Association, or COFA.
COFA. I've heard that term, but let's break down what it actually means in this context.
So COFA is an agreement the U.S. has with 3 Pacific Island nations: Micronesia, the Marshall Islands, and Palau. And it's basically a strategic trade-off. The U.S. provides them with significant economic aid, and in exchange, those nations give the U.S. exclusive military access and defense responsibility. It effectively blocks anyone else, like China or Russia, from setting up a base there.
It's a compromise that gives the U.S. security access without full ownership. But for Greenland to even enter a COFA, what would have to happen first?
Greenland would absolutely have to separate from Denmark and become fully independent.
And that ties back to the $5.6 billion payment idea.
Precisely. Those payouts were seen as the catalyst to get that independence vote to happen. Officials always said diplomacy was the first option, but the COFA model was the end goal that could follow independence. It was positioned as the least aggressive of the three strategies: buy, invade, or ally.
Okay, so let's pull all these threads together. Why Greenland? Why does this territory that's 80% ice sheet hold such immense, almost obsessive value for the U.S.?
It really comes down to two things: geography and geology. Geographically, Greenland is just positioned at this choke point in the North Atlantic. It provides the shortest air route between North America and Europe, and it controls these vital waterways.
And that gets us back to the GI-UK gap, right? Greenland, Iceland, UK.
That's the one. It's a critical naval gateway. During the Cold War, it was for tracking Soviet submarines. Today, the U.S. wants to put more radar and naval patrols there to watch modern Russian and Chinese vessels moving between the Arctic and the Atlantic. Controlling that gap is essential for projecting U.S. and NATO power.
And then there's the geology, the resources under the ice.
Incredible mineral riches. Greenland has huge deposits of rare earth elements, which are critical for everything from smartphones and EV batteries to, missile guidance systems. A 2023 survey found 25 of the 34 minerals the EU considers critical are right there. Plus, scientists think there are major untapped oil and gas reserves.
And getting access to those rare earths is also about the bigger competition with China.
Exactly. It's about supply chain security and reducing dependency on a geopolitical competitor. But here's the conflict. Greenland's current economy is almost all fishing, and its indigenous population is largely opposed to large-scale mining and drilling because they fear the environmental and cultural damage. So U.S. strategic interest is in direct conflict with what many locals want.
This deep dive has really just laid bare this profound conflict at the heart of modern geopolitics. You have this desire for resources and military position colliding head-on with these foundational principles of national sovereignty and alliances like NATO.
It's a perfect example of how strategic ambitions can really challenge the post-war order. You have one ally threatening another over territory. It completely changes who you perceive the threat to be.
And on that note, we'll leave you with a final thought, and this comes directly from the source material. Considering everything we've talked about, the economist Jeffrey Sachs suggested that in the current climate, Europe is far more likely to be invaded from the West, U.S., than from the East. Just consider the implications of that statement for a military alliance built entirely on collective security.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Greenland and the price of sovereignty.
We'll see you next time.